Okay, with that nice lull, I guess we can probably start. First of all, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. For those of you who are unfamiliar, my name is Andrew. I'm the Research and Policy Officer for the Centre for Economics, Policy and History. What? Okay, I'm going to stand here. Apologies. I'm blocking our branding. Very important. So, out of interest, has anyone here been to one of our ESRC events before? That's the retention we like, a good 30%. Excellent, good. So what we like to do here is we like to talk about a current trend through the lens of a discipline called economic history. And today we're going to be talking about AI. We're going to be chatting GPT, but the GPT here does not mean ChatGPT. It means general purpose technology. These are technologies that have applications beyond perhaps their initial scope. And we're going to be talking about historical examples of this and whether or not AI can count as one and what we might expect if it is one. So to start, you might have seen this expression before, history repeats itself. Does anyone know the second half of that expression? It is because nobody was listening the first time. And it is on this that historians base their careers. This idea that the past has happened a certain way, it will happen the exact same way again. Economic historians have a slightly more nuanced approach, which is partially informed by Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. That we can identify patterns in the past, often through data, which is what we tend to do at our centre, and through these patterns we can tell a story about the past and connect it to the present and indeed the future. So what are these general purpose technologies? Well, according to Lipsey, Carlot and Becker, a general purpose technology is single, recognizable, and also generic. It can be widely used across the economy in all different areas, and it creates lots of spillover effects. So there's lots of examples of this. They go as far back as bronze and iron, but there are others too. Steam is one, and it's very interesting reading this poll how people are worried about their jobs being affected by AI. People were also worried about their jobs being affected by steam power. I'm not going to read you the whole thing because we've only got an hour, but there are some interesting lines in it, such as the poor weaver's visage is warped by despair, for steam of his cuts him out of his share. So the poor weaver's being undermined by steam power, as is the blacksmith. He's outdone from an anchor ere down to attack, etc., etc. So you can have a read of that. I can circulate these slides to anyone who's interested. The internet was a big one as well. There was a little less fear and a little bit more optimism, but what we do see here in this newspaper from Sligo in the mid-90s is that the internet they're advising putting the internet into all different kinds of jobs, which I'm sure if you work in any sort of job that has a computer component, you have seen your office try to implement AI for some reason or another. And I do enjoy this idea of the internet arriving on the scene, and I feel very sorry for this 1989 company who named themselves Internet, not realizing the genius word they had stumbled upon. Those poor guys, I wonder whatever happened to them. But AI, there's a lot of anxiety about it. There's a lot of anxiety about whether or not it's going to take our jobs, and we know it's bad because academics have started writing papers on it, so it must be serious. But what do we mean when we talk about impacts and spillover effects and what our speakers are going to speak about today? Well, if we consider an invention that has impacts, for a general purpose technology, there are spillover effects that will have their own impacts. So to give an example, railways is a good one. You have the railway, they're obviously fast, they can move lots of goods around with capacity, they offer connectivity, and they're also cheaper than horse and carriage. But there's other effects as well. As a result of railways, you have things like suburbs developing. Commuting becomes more commonplace. You have industries moving away from the cities because workers can travel to the industry as opposed to having to live within walking distance of it. And then there are lots of impacts off the back of those, which may have their own spillover effects too. So it's this expanding web. So a true general purpose technology will have all of this. Does AI have this? Well, arguably, there's the kind of more limited impacts we can see, such as a tech boom, it's impacting the job market. There's military potential. AI is being used to identify targets with limited effect. Journalism is becoming a lot more difficult now. The whole profession has been challenged by this. Cybersecurity, even the judicial system has also been challenged, and there's probably a lot more too. So it looks like it could be a general purpose technology, and if it is, what can history tell us about it? So for today, we have our three speakers. We have Malte, Judy, and Mike. And they are each going to talk about a historical case study and what it can tell us about AI. They're going to speak for about 6 to 7 minutes each, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A where we can talk as a group about these things, which I'll manage. Does that sound okay? Fantastic. So, in my other life, I do a lot of stand-up comedy, and there's nothing more awkward than sitting down to silence. So please welcome in the traditional way our first speaker, Malte, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everybody for coming. I have some good news and I have some bad news for you. I know it's Halloween tomorrow, but I'll start with the good news here. So the good news is that by now we are quite experienced with the arrival of new technologies. Let me just ask here, who remembers the time before the internet? Anybody? You? Good. Who remembers the time before the smartphone? No, almost everybody, yeah. So as you can see, you probably experienced the arrival of new key technologies in your lifetime. And that really puts you apart from, say, the farmer in 1750 or so before the Industrial Revolution, whose life was more or less the same as that of all its ancestors for centuries before him. So we can learn from that. And something we can learn is that, look at this map from Scotland here, of watermills in Scottish parishes. Darker the colour, the more watermills there were. And for those of you who are a bit familiar with Scottish geography, that looks remarkably similar to where population and industry is now in Scotland. So what we can learn here is that if you use technology and if you're ready to adopt the new technology using your old equipment, the water wheels here, you can have a significant leap start and be up quicker and more successful in adapting to the new age. So let me give you a more specific example here, which is this Underwood mill in Paisley, a town next to Glasgow. So this mill was founded in the 1780s. And initially it was powered by muscle power, by these poor guys here turning a crank all day. There were around 100 of them, doing nothing else than just this. So whenever you think your job's boring, remember these guys here. So unsurprisingly, within 2 years, they figured out that this is not the best way to power a mill, so they used horses for it. Horse was better than a man at doing something like this, but still not really the best thing you can do. So very quickly, they adopted water power for the mill, installed a water wheel. But they didn't stop there, they kept innovating, and within 10 years, they bought the first Watt steam engine for a cotton mill in Scotland. So that shows you how quickly and how readily people were back then in adopting new technologies. And this mill was really successful and kept expanding throughout the whole period by adopting the new stuff. And I think that's the lesson we can learn from this. You can all use AI now on your computer, so go ahead and do it and figure out what to do with it. That's basically the takeaway here. Now let's turn to the bad news. And the question here is this time different? Is AI just a new general-purpose technology, like the water wheel, the steam engine, or the internet? And so far, I think the answer is clearly yes. But the current large language models that you can use are incredible pieces of engineering, but in the end, not too much more than what some people call a bit sarcastically autocorrect on steroids. The real question here, I think, is about AGI. And AGI is artificial general intelligence, which is something that is as capable and intelligent as a human brain in basically every domain that we can do. And that will, I think, be very different from the previous general purpose technologies in a way that in the Industrial Revolution, we basically replaced augmented muscle power, manual labor, with machines. The difference now with AI is that with AGI, we are creating independent actors that are replacing our brains in a way, and it's not our muscles, but our brains that make us human. So that, I think, is really something else. And the artificial intelligence revolution, in the end, not at the moment, but once we get AGI, when will it happen? We don't know. But once we get there, it might be more similar to the Industrial Revolution or the Neolithic Revolution in a way. And will it be paradise? Maybe. Maybe we'll live in a world of plenty, or it might be the end of our species. We don't know. That's my bad news, and these words I'll give to Judy.
I'm Judy Stephenson. I no, what did I do?
I don't know. Just press forward. Or to the right. Yeah, that's fine. It's working. Oh, the other
Oh,
one.
no, that one. Okay, this way. Okay.
Perfect.
And I'm a historian of labour markets and pay and wages and jobs. So I'm going to talk about what happens to jobs and what you get paid when you get a big general purpose technology or technical innovation in the workplace. So, thank you, Malte. You've given us a nice kind of, technical innovations tend to happen very fast. So you usually have one change in the workplace brought about by lots of others. So if you think about what has happened to the world of information processing in bureaucratic settings, also called the office, in the last 40 years, you went from copying being, an onerous process which required a sort of gatekeeper, an expert on how to do this, being some kind of kind of application of several bits of machinery to a simple machine. You then added word processing to it, nobody copies anymore, you just print everything else. But that meant massive organizational change, because if you say to a bunch of 20-year-olds, typing pool, they have no idea what you're talking about. And for those of you under 25, you can Google the typing pool. It's it's been fun. So the point is that the process that Malte's just showed us, which is muscle power, through to horsepower, to water power, to steam power, happens quite quickly, but it doesn't all happen in the same organizational environment. Frequently, it didn't all happen in the same place. You've shown us a very nice example of a particular mill where actually that was adapted, but that required huge infrastructural adaptations and changes. So, which one is it again?
That one.
That one.
Nailed it.
It is, okay. So technology doesn't lower wages, but it displaces human work. It moves the place of work from one place with one bit of kit to another. And that means that it changes the value of work. And here's where there's a kind of inside kind of gig, or a bit of fun in sort of economics and the history of economic thought. It's very difficult to value human work. So the same work in different places at different times has completely different values. It's based on what's going on in that society at the time. Like economists do a lot of it's about productivity, but actually they're not really sure why the variation for the same work in different places actually emerges. But what new technology means is there will be a change in that value. So that's what you need to worry about if someone's paying you. If someone isn't paying you, can you tell me what your gig is? So you don't see wage cuts. You do see changes in the way that people earn, and you do of course see job changes or cuts. And I'm going to say that we should think about this, or the way to understand this if you are worried about what's going to happen to your wage or what's going to happen to your job, is a change in wage systems. I'm going to call that wage systems. So the other title for this talk is, would you like to be paid for your time, or would you like to be paid for what you produce? It's an interesting distinction. So examples of wage systems are being paid for your time. And in 21st century Northwestern Europe, most of us are paid for our time. And we accept that we have a job that's paid in a unit, like it's a day, a week, an hour, a year, and we're paid for doing something that's measured by that, and that's how we account for work on a per hour. And legislation about wages and legislation about how the labour market works is all predicated on the idea that there's a wage per hour that people are worth. That is a very new thing. It's a 20th century thing, mostly. Came in, it started to be reintroduced, particularly in manufacturing work in the 19th century, when it became very, very difficult to pay people the other way that owners of capital like to pay people, which is a piece rate. I'm sure you've all heard of this. And piece rates are still very, very common in manufacturing outside of Europe, and in developing economies, where you basically get paid a small amount for every unit you produce. It's associated with outwork, and then when piece rates are paid in a work environment, then you quickly get norms and expectations about how many pieces people should produce. Then you get different ways of valuing things. It ends up being very complicated. Another example of a wage system is commission, where you paid a small portion of everything you sell, or everything you move, or everything you've done. And then there's always incentive and bonus structures. You can get very complicated with lots of hybrids of all of these as well. Now the other system, which we don't see so much today, but was very common, is a gang system. Only the boss gets paid, and then the boss pays you. Now this, if I'm telling you this is very difficult to value human work, you should worry about this one. And the reason why you should worry about this one is it's much easier from an employer's point of view, if you can't value the work, to say to the guy who's good at organising stuff, or the foreman on the shop floor, or the guy who runs the team, or the head salesman, tell you what, how about we just give you this for the quarter, and there'll be an incentive bonus of this, that, the other, and you just manage them. Because otherwise we've got to sort out, what everybody's worth, and that's hard work. So just paying the boss is a really old system. It's called the journeyman system, and it was the norm in very, very large factories right up until the end of the 19th century. Here particularly, and it's a norm in the shipbuilding industry. Whatever. So there's hybrids of all of these. And the reason why there's hybrids of all of these and why you should have a thing is because although we've been thinking about this for a long time, we still don't fully understand why some wage systems get applied in some places and others in other places, because the hybrids are really complicated. But what we do know is that when there is a change to technology, employers play with these things. They use a change in systems to find the value. So I'll give you an example of that steam engine. Matthew Bolton, when selling James Watt's steam engine, he needed his engine fitters to be able to fit in a certain amount of time. So he experimented with a couple of weeks of paying them by the day to see how they did. Then he set men of what he thought were a similar skill, and a similar ability, and similar effort to do the same thing by the piece. Then he compared how it had gone. Then he swapped them over. Then he used the day rate to set a different piece rate. Then he used the piece productivity to set a. So he changed the systems to see whether he could get the most out of the men in that place at the time. But this happens in all sorts. Arkwright did similar with day work and night work in the first cotton factories. So if you're wondering or worried about what the bot coming into your workplace is going to do to how you get paid, you might want to think about what history tells us about that. The first is, if you're doing work where you're not in a team and you're not in a workplace, where you can't be observed making an effort, all of the centuries before this one basically say you should not expect to get paid for your time. So one of the anomalies of the post-COVID era, it's been very short so far, is that there's lots of us doing work in places where we're not being observed, and we're not being managed, and we're still getting paid for our time. As a historian, I say to you, this may be unsustainable. Don't expect to get paid for your time if you're not being observed and managed and overstated. And if you are in a team where what you are doing is observed, and you're collaborating with people, and you're in a workplace together with people. First of all, isn't it fun? Sorry, I'm for this. I'm for being in a workplace. Be prepared to collaborate on the value of work, to work out how new things work, and to tell your managers and your bosses and the people working with you, what is valuable. I worked on this, I did it in this way, it worked for me, look at the extra value that I got. That's good, you're helping them work out what your work is worth. That's good, because if they can value it, you're more likely to get paid it. And be aware, if they can't value it, it might be the boss who gets paid and then pays you. So the indirect method, because this holds for most of human history as well. So, yes, thinking about how the bot will change, and AI will change the way that you earn. Do you want to be paid for your time or what you produce? That's the key question. Thank you. We're going to hand over to Michael.
Evening, everybody. So, Malte gets to the question, is this going to be a paradise? Which is really a fundamental question. Judy's been thinking about workers and wages, and a lot of these outcomes are going to be predicated then on what governments do. So I'm a business historian. I think about change in companies and markets over long periods of time. And so what I'm interested in is thinking about the historical analogues and long-run trends we can look at to think about how government is going to interact with this technological change to determine outcomes for lots of different stakeholders. Now, I like to particularly think about change at the beginning of the 19th century. So I'm interested in the second industrial revolution, so automobiles, chemicals, and the granddaddy of all GPTs, electricity. So I'm interested in what happens when we have this profound set of technological changes that massively increase economic activity. And what we see is a couple of things that I think are really important to bear in mind as we now start to think about how AI begins to play out in the wider economy. First, and one of the most sort of fundamental issues that we saw in the early 20th century on the left-hand side is what we term sort of economic or industrial concentration. So as this technology, new technologies were diffused into the economy, electricity in particular, we began to see it being used and scaled up in lots of different industries. Technology was sort of being taken on board, and certain companies would become far more successful at deploying it. They would become economically powerful. They would start to merge and take over other companies. So concentration, by this I mean the market share, the control of an industry by companies became more and more concentrated. Fewer and fewer companies were able to dominate industries. So we can think of examples like US Steel, Standard Oil, these enormous companies that became extremely economically powerful, politically powerful, which is another sort of important dynamic here. So what we see here is early 20th century, this rising industrial concentration in key industries that is occurring as technology is diffused and used and then scaled up. Today, we're seeing a very, very similar pattern within the use of AI. So this is just one example we have on the right. This is the market share of cloud providers. So the three biggest cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, have a market share of probably getting on for about 70% of that entire market. And we see this in other sort of aspects as well. We can think about this in terms of the chips that are critical in sort of enabling these AI products to be used. NVIDIA absolutely dominates this market. We can think about it in terms of the models, the products and the models that are being developed. Again, these are being sort of concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. And this is a big issue because the economic power that these companies and their owners can exert is translating into political power. Now, what's interesting is in dealing with this problem at the beginning of the 20th century, we actually began to see the rise of what we can think of as the regulatory state. So this is the progressive era in the US, and what we actually see is the government beginning to take a much stronger regulatory stance to try and actually address some of these problems. So we see the rise of antitrust laws, which are aimed at sort of breaking up these huge sort of monopoly powered industrial entities. So we sort of see the increase in sort of trying to bring competition into markets and break them up. We also see the rise of the regulatory state in terms of protecting consumers. The Food and Drug Act of 1906 is one of the first efforts by the US government to actually protect the safety of consumers. So we see the rise of a regulatory state that is becoming into play to sort of try and deal with these economic and political outcomes. So the question we might want to think about today is, what's the political appetite and the political capacity that is available to address this situation on the right? What is the capacity to actually bring in competition to these markets, break up some of these increasingly powerful economic players, and actually sort of protect consumer rights? What's the political power there? Who has it? Where are the vested interests? So, whose paradise maybe is a question we should be thinking about, because those with political and economic power will be the ones who can determine where the returns from this sort of economic development go to. Second issue when I think about the role of government is it's actually historically played a very, very important role in enabling both the development of the underlying technologies and their diffusion. On the left, what we've got is looking at US government spending, total spend on what they term basic science. Basic science is like another way of thinking about, so the government spends to encourage research and development. That could be directly into government-owned labs, it could be through universities. This is the way in which the government seeks to improve and sort of direct sort of investigation and research into sort of technology and science. And what we've seen is this dramatic decline across the 20th century. The US government has, in effect, and certainly in the last few years, looked to get itself out of spending directly on R&D and on science. Should we care about that? What's happened is we've seen that most of this funding has simply been replaced by business. Capital markets, private funding. This has sort of come in to replace the spend by government. Why should we care about that? That's okay. This is still getting done. Technology is still being invested in. R&D is still happening. This might give us a sense of, though, on the other side, why we might be a bit worried about this. This is looking at economic outcomes in terms of productivity and the amount of effective number of researchers that are required to drive these outcomes. And this is changing enormously across the century. The amount of money we now have to spend to drive good outcomes in terms of R&D and in terms of sort of technological breakthroughs has grown exponentially. So this relationship is indicative that actually achieving these outcomes requires huge investments, and these are risky investments and they're uncertain. And that's not always what investors want. They don't necessarily like risk, they don't necessarily like uncertainty, and they don't necessarily like long payback periods. So we might end up where we actually have a lot of volatility in terms of funding critical sort of investments in technology as investors turn away because of the cost, the ramping up of the cost. So as the government retreats and we're left to the private markets, capital markets to fund this could lead to a lot of volatility and sort of then the fact that we miss out on technological advancements and development. The government plays a really important role in driving these outcomes. It's done so historically, but it is now retreating out of these spaces. That might be something we want to care about. Finally, and this is a related point to that, what happens if all this spending that is occurring now, directed at AI, directed at these technologies, at these related companies, due to its uncertainty, due to the volatility in the returns, the time periods, what happens if this actually turns into a bubble? We're pumping money in. When do the returns come? Now, we've got people in the audience who have thought very closely and sort of deeply about these issues, about stock market bubbles and busts. So John Turner at the back there. So the idea here is that if we have a technology shock, investors might rush into this market. We've got lots of cheap money and credit for them to invest. We've got lots of ways for them to speculate in these outcomes. Marketability, the idea here, we have lots of instruments, mechanisms for them to invest in these markets. All of this is encouraging bubble-like outcomes. Okay? And this could well lead to a bust. People simply realise that the returns aren't coming as quickly as they want, and they start to get out of the market, and we end up with sort of capital flight and a bust in these companies. Should we care? Is that a bad thing? Now, we might sit there and think, I don't really care. Sam Altman at OpenAI, it goes bust for him. Do I care? Potentially, yes, because it turns out a lot of recent research has actually demonstrated all of these companies, these enormous corporations, Microsoft, Nvidia, Oracle, the interrelationships between them, harvesting all of this money through these investors, spreading it between each other, investing in each other, taking stakes, they're all deeply interlinked now. So if we actually have a stock market bust and one of these companies go down, that might start to take much larger portions of the economy with it. And we may also lead to a point where actually really important technological developments, which may occur elsewhere in the world, because the Chinese are running a completely different way of managing these outcomes, occurs somewhere else. And they get to control this technology and how it's used. So I think there's sort of really important roles that we need to think about in terms of the role of the state, the role of government in managing the regulatory environment, determining how the returns are sort of divvied up, if we like, who actually benefits from these technological developments and advances, how we think about workers, how we think about wages, how we think about the diffusion of the technology, because there are potentially enormously difficult and bad outcomes if the state retreats from these and leaves it solely to the market. Thank you.
I was a little bit worried when we came up with the idea for this that it might be a bit depressing. So we've had AI is going to come faster than we think, no one's going to get paid, and the economy is going to collapse. Okay, so on that happy note, I think it would be nice to open to the floor for some questions. I have some to get the ball rolling, but if anyone has some questions sparked from our talk, this is the point of the ESRC Festival, is to encourage conversation. So yes, sir.
Can I go back to the second last slide? You mentioned about the shift from government to business in terms of R&D investment.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the correlation between that left-hand graph and the right-hand one about the increased number of researchers.
Yeah. So on the right, this is just really an indication that effective investment now in R&D is becoming much more expensive. So what you're required to do in terms of the number of researchers required to achieve good breakthrough outcomes that will drive productivity in the economy has gone up enormously. So the issue here then is, where is that investment coming from? If it comes from the business side, that's right. Capital markets, private sources of finance, they have driven a lot of this investment. But if that leaves, if we have a bust, where's it going to come from? Because the government has just now spent 50 years retreating out of its sort of this historical position it's had across the 20th century, where they have spent a lot on basic science and R&D. And there's a degree about uncertainty there. Governments tend to have longer time horizons, longer term commitments than private investors will have. Does that explain it? Is that clearer?
Yes. I guess the graph on the right is effectively saying technology is getting harder to innovate.
Yes.
This is called the low-hanging fruit thesis, where basically the idea is at the beginning of the 20th century we harvested a lot of low-hanging fruit around technology and R&D, and it's now getting much, much harder, much more expensive and harder to find good ideas. Yes.
Yeah. What advice would you give a 10-year-old grandchild to be studying or is just get a good general education, be a good communicator, because the pace of change is too fast, and by the time you're in your early 20s, the world has changed dramatically.
I think it's the one for each of you, I suppose. Judy, you want to take the lead?
Yeah, I would say as broad an education as you possibly can. One of the challenges society faces is we've spent 40 years telling people just study STEM. The maths will do it. And then researchers come into the place and they're unable to access the previous empirics, if you like. So they're just running the same experiment over and over again. And that's wasteful. So we're not recording the experiences of researchers, you know what I mean, and harnessing, you know, the learning, because we've said it's all in the maths. But now the opportunity is, the one thing that AI does quite well is the maths. So if that's taken care of a little bit, you know, all the grunt work of kind of, you know, doing the equations, checking whatever else can be done, maybe we can do a bit more about the context and the contextualization and, you know, thinking about effects and responsibilities. And so particularly, you see children coming into, I call them children, recent adults, coming into to third level institutions. The ones who are beginning to do better are the ones with a broader education, where they've taken a number of subjects right up to the end, and where they're aware of what geography is, where they've done bits of history, where they've maybe, you know, carried on doing what we call religious studies, or, you know, kind of social studies, you know, into their A levels and beyond, because they've got questions about how the world works, not just about what equations needed for operating something.
If you ask of the AI researchers, I think a lot of them say you should become a plumber now, because the thing the AI will get good at first is probably all the brain stuff, and the thing that requires to do both, like use your brain and your hands, like combine those things. This is where robotics come into the picture, but robotics is still behind in comparison to AI and to the pure brain stuff. So probably something that involves also a bit of manual labor and skills in that particular field is a good choice at the moment.
Do well in your carpentry classes.
Yeah. I suppose the advantage in the 18th century was if you had a 10-year-old grandchild, you could simply employ them, and it was legal. So that's less of a problem. Michael, anything to?
So I think if you actually look at what the AI models actually are, this gives you some clues, and you're getting to it, right? They're probability models. That's what they are. They're probabilistic. So if you care about accuracy, if you care about being true, these models are not necessarily going to provide that for you.
We end up as proofreaders.
No, you don't. Well, I would say being reflective, thoughtful, critical, somebody who actually draws on a wider range of experience and can look at that and say, does that, I think there could be problems, I think this isn't telling me what I think it's supposed to be telling me. I think all of that really matters. You know, I think absolutely that ability to bring a sort of this critical and reflective dimension to effectively what are probability models. They're not the truth. They're not necessarily particularly accurate. So, you know, I think there will be either interacting with models and being able to understand what the issues are with them, I think will be really important.
Jesus. Only a matter of time or before they reach that, you know, with the context and data pouring.
So I've read a bunch of it. I mean, I've talked to different people about this, and I have to say, I am not a technologist, and I'm certainly not a mathematician, which is basically where it seems to me the real answers to all of this lies. But there does seem to actually be quite a lot of people who think there are serious constraints, and that now we've fed the models everything. Yeah, there's the whole internet, there's the whole of recorded history. What else have we got to feed them that will drive this like significant leap forward in improving outcomes, right?
So there's two camps basically at the moment. There's the LLM camp, where people say that LLMs will lead us to AGI in 2 years or 2 or 3 years. We will be there really, really soon. And then there's people who are really skeptic about this and say we really have to rethink AI, and LLMs will reach that end pretty soon, and then the stock market will go bust and then it's all there.
So, I mean, maybe. I think the other thing to think about is time's a really important component of all of this. You know, I think what a lot of people have now realised is in all this boosterism, the rush, the actual realisation that it's in the use and the utility that you actually find the good outcomes, and that is going to take a lot of time and experimentation. So suddenly expecting companies to be able to go, we're going to do this with it. The benefits with electricity took probably about 40 years. And that was like a lot of experimentation, a lot of sort of like, and then reconfiguring entire ways of doing business. Not incremental, but like ripping up and starting from scratch and saying, if we build this around this technology, what does that look like? Time really matters. And that's why it matters to things like stock markets and investors who may not be prepared to wait.
I've got absolutely no idea about technology. I'm a creative artist. Where does creativity come into all of this?
Judy, do you want to talk to
It's an important part of the critical master. But actually, while we were talking there, I was thinking about, photography as a general purpose technology. It took over the representative, like here's an accurate picture of. So engravers were out of business because engravers were in the business of depicting things accurately for publication, and they lost everything to photography. But those who were involved in representing or communicating other things, the art world after photography got really good changed utterly. So the law I suppose you could say unintended consequences or unknown effects about how people will respond to no technology is a perfect substitute for the thing that has gone before. There is always something that's lacking. And the question about what happens to that function is the great unknown, and very difficult for us to model because you never get any data on it. But if you think what happened to representative, art or visual art, that goes on walls in the time since the late 19th century, and just look at how creative that became, there should be a little seed of hope, perhaps.
Perhaps the government doesn't seem to think
No, the government
the
seems.
arts are particularly useful in terms of science.
But that's a different. Remember, the arts became publicly funded in a period of time when the state was the biggest player in time. After the Second World War, the state was the biggest player. The state was bigger than all the companies put together, and also the insight that if you got everybody together, democratically and taxed them appropriately, you could create a fiscal state that had the powers of coordination and finance to solve the problems. That is no longer the case. The state is not capable, and it is not the biggest player anymore. Partly because democracy's got some problems, and partly because the finance of the fiscal state isn't it. And so one thing, implication that we should really have is we seem to have a really big problem with private money funding art. We should probably think again, because no matter what you think about where the money comes from or how the money comes from, it is the oldest model in town. You know what I mean? Patronage kind of built the creative world around us, and I think we should all just start going, that's okay, if we want to have funding for the arts.
I would agree with that, except as my friend here talked about education. And in the education system, science is becoming much more important than what one might call creative arts.
But lots of private money still likes paying for creativity.
I think
we mightn't like
Give me some addresses.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting though, if you look at technological change, right? So, if we go back, CDs were meant to, be the end of vinyl. Kindle was the end of the printed book, and what we've actually seen is consumer preferences actually become quite sticky and quite deeply engaged in forms of representation or sort of certain products that, you know, we have preferences, right? I mean, I still buy a lot of vinyl. I for weird personal reasons, I just much prefer it. You know, I don't like Spotify. I don't like, you know, online audio files. I like record sleeves. I don't know, that's probably a weird man thing. Yeah, but you know, and the same with books, right? You know, so I think again, you know, where preferences end up falling around this, there could still be, you know, a lot of demand for forms of production and creativity that fall well outside the sort of what can be achieved by these technologies.
This question over here.
Those of us who have reached our mid-60s will remember a time whenever people were predicting that computers would produce the paperless office, you know, little slogans like that. And obviously there was really a big incentive for any company to try and predict what they were going to achieve with their companies, because they wanted to attract investment. And those phrases like the paperless office caught on, but in fact it turned out that relational databases were the big thing that actually really transformed society and lay behind quite a lot of the functions of the internet. But so at the moment, I'm looking back, I would think we're probably going to get an awful lot here. We're going to get over prediction about AI is going to produce dangerous machines that are going to take over the world. But the change will come, but probably not as quickly. But the one thing that was very clear looking back at the 1970s and the 80s and even 90s, there was a lot of turmoil in industry associated with the changes brought in with computers. And I think we can expect to see, I'm a retired teacher, by the way, so I sort of think about why would be teaching if I was still in school. But you know, I sort of think there is going to be a lot of turmoil in the workplace. And the suggestion about people taking up plumbing or bricklaying is probably not a bad one, because you know, those are things that simply are not going to be computerized, and they're not going to be roboticized, and care workers and whatever. You know, those are the areas we should be thinking about.
But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So the built environment is the one area which the bot can't, you know, which AI cannot, and actually. Mechanization or technological innovation has always been very poor at this, for the reason that it can make the thing, it can't maintain it. So that's the problem. To identify where the problem is, go in and fix it, polish it. That's idiosyncratic, and it can't be mechanized or mass produced or, you know, done by the thing. That is a problem that your typical computer programmer doesn't see. I mean, they see it, but this is the reason why we have the problems with hacks, computer security, cybersecurity, and everything else is they have this problem and they refuse to see it because they build systems and networks and code and whatever else, and then they go, actually that's a bit rubbish, let's start again. And you know, so they've got, you know, kind of sites and codes and all this kind of thing. You know, the internet is just awash with wasted infrastructure, just like our built environment, which also then needs, you know, clever people who understand how to repair things to go in and do it. And I think we're going to return to an age of repair. It's already a trendy sort of thing in, you know, lots of circles to take old things and make them useful again. You know, and you tend to find ideas like that inform problems in the real world and, you know, turn into a culture.
So technology prediction is really interesting, right? Futurists and this whole idea of like predicting what technology will do and where it will become really meaningful. So you can go back and read really interesting sort of futurists writing about technological transformation in the 1960s and 70s. And it's like, okay, so where's my flying skateboard, right? You know, where is my flying car already? Come on, you know, we were there by about 1960 and it's still not happening. Why does that happen? So there's a really good book by a guy called David Edgerton, who's a historian of technology, called Shock of the Old. And he basically says, well, why do we have all these old technologies that persist? Why do we keep on using loads of old technologies? great example. IBM mainframes, still maintained, still coded in Cobalt. If you can code in Cobalt,
Yes.
you know, there is big money for you in the banking sector. Why? Because large amounts of the banking sector are still operated on IBM late 1960s mainframes. So the idea that suddenly everything is going to be transformed within a very short period of time, well, historically that's not how these processes work. They take much longer than expected, they're much bumpier, and their actual utility, this is what I keep coming back to, their actual utility, working out what that is, happens in its use and its interaction over time. And cost of repair and cost of maintenance, which is something Edgerton comes back to a lot, that really matters.
Yeah.
How do we keep up, how do we ensure that this keeps working? Okay, and now maybe AI operates in a completely different pathway to this, but historically these pathways are very, very difficult to predict. So a lot of the boosterism we see now, we are going to be able to reduce our headcount by 15% because of X, Y, and Z, maybe, but probably what the real benefits will be, and therefore saying to somebody now, you need to learn this. I find that incredibly uncomfortable.
Can I throw in one thing? The one thing that I think is likely to be true is that there will be job loss. At one stage I taught something that was brand new then called desktop publishing.
Oh yeah.
And I remember teaching a guy who works in a newsletter, and he kept saying, well, all your colleagues are going to come. And I went, no, they hate people like you. Because everybody's going to be out of work, it's going to be one or two people, and of course that is exactly what was happening.
Judy's the person to ask about displacement, labour displacement, and does that really happen?
Yeah, and of course other jobs came along, but for some people it was the end of the career.
Yeah, no, labour displacement is real. And I think the debate is problematised, becomes a problem because economists don't like it to be real. Because if it's real, then so actually a way to think about this is in the physical world, physicists allow that there are things called phased transitions. So, where, in chemistry and things, there's it's not an instant, all the molecules don't fit together perfectly the first time. There are other effects, and those effects can be long lasting, and they're polluting. So the idea that you have phased transitions and hysteresis is a thing in the natural sciences. We need to absorb it in the social sciences rather than assuming that it's always, perfectly competitive and the world just transforms overnight. Because then if we allow there to be phased transitions in social science, then we can understand what the side products are and deal with them. It's a much nicer paradigm to be in. Economists might get there, you never know.
I would have real fear that in the same way as we had to eventually have laws to control the big oil companies in America and the big production companies, we better get used to the fact that at some stage we are going to have to control the big IT companies. But it seems to me at the minute that the people with money are running governments rather than governments controlling them. And that, even looking at some of your graphs up there, it seems to be a growing trend, and I don't know that it'll be in the best interest of
Question here?
The thing that your presentation came across very clearly, though, is that it's about, as you say, a phased transition, people moving into other jobs or skill sets.
Yeah.
Not that they don't have it, there are no jobs to go around anymore, but that's often the way AI is positioned, that AI is going to take all our jobs, and yet, as I understand it, AI it's a model, it's a collection of data, and yes, it's very clever at sorting and sifting and recombining in all sorts of different ways. But it's crucial to understand that it doesn't come up with any new data.
Yeah, exactly.
It can't come up with any new philosophical theories.
It's
All
not
it can do
creative.
is shift around the existing ones.
Yeah.
And I think that's to the point earlier that things like creativity and innovation, in the arts as well, there's still a place for that. It can't do
We
that.
were just saying that it's damned witty. You know what I mean? Like the AI is very funny. It's dry, it's arid, and it's got a sharp line. But it's not creative in the sense that it can't make new lateral connections that have never been made before. So, as an academic, if you're trying to use it, and you are trying to bring a new theory to a new data set, it can't do it. It has no idea what you're talking about, because if there's nothing on it, it's not there. So,
This question over here.
So my question is probably more on the political economy of the whole AI problem, because we are talking about labor displacement, gang payment styles, and concentration of science in the private hands. What do you think are the consequences of increasing inequality, and how is the AI related with inequality?
is that general? I just want to say, actually, to finish up on the labour displacement. The labour displacement within a democratic, social, kind of generally, centrist sort of economy that tries to redistribute the gains from production fairly is a serious problem, and it's a problem that when all boats are rising, when there is growth, the populace don't really mind transfers being made to those who have been displaced. In an environment where there isn't growth, people really mind transfers being made to those who have been displaced. So one of the jobs of the education system surely should be, and people say this a lot, but it's worthwhile just stating it again, should be to prepare people for flexibility. And of course, this is the problem with the STEM thing, is it hasn't prepared people for flexibility in the labour market at all. It's given them core skills that supposedly are transferable across, but doesn't enable them to socially be flexible within that. So that's worth talking about. And that calls for us to take some kind of sense of human responsibility, psychology, ethics, all those kind of things into the workplace and into the way that we prepare people for the workplace.
So should we be concerned that economic concentration has bad outcomes on political systems and political power? Absolutely. That is a really significant concern everybody should be worried about, because giving individuals who have such enormous economic power pathways into political decision making, now that has, they may have really good intentions, they may not. And they're able to exert this political power to sort of drive their own agendas, ideological agendas often. I think we need to be extremely wary of that. And I think, going back again and looking at the rise of the regulatory state in the US, in the progressive era, so this is where people like Louis Brandeis and this real push to actually rein this behaviour in, because they recognised that and they were very concerned about that. One of the really interesting, if you look at that time, there was this really interesting phenomenon of what was called muckraking journalism. And this was the idea that the press go out and they root through your bins and they're like, in some ways what we don't like, right? But in many ways, this was a group of people who held, very powerful people to account. And they were actually out there and really sort of trying to sort of, hold people to account for their behaviour and what they did. But if you look at what we have today in terms of a media landscape and the capacity for people to hold, people to account, a lot of this is now being controlled by the same people who are controlling the tech.
Mm-hmm. So just relates that to the inequality question there. So go on.
I know, so the round point off.
Sorry, Andrew.
Just to round the point off.
I interrupted.
Sorry, no. It's round. So, of course, the returns of, who shapes the returns is who exerts the political power. So if you can control the economic power and the political power, you will be able to determine where the returns fall, and you may not massively care about inequality.
The powerful don't. Mm-hmm.
So a question there, and then we'll go here.
Yeah. Just on regulation and sort of the externalities of these technologies, is there any historical precedent for maybe places where it was regulated quite quickly versus where maybe these companies were allowed to let these technologies progress without externalities? Is there a precedent for that? Because one of the big problems that people are having is with water usage and stuff like that, and also the fact that it's trained off of copyrighted materials and that people aren't getting paid for that sort of thing.
Start with the past, maybe Malte, do you want to take the lead on that?
About the recent past year, I would say the EU and the US were vastly different in how they regulate tech companies. The US obviously allowed them to just do their thing and become big and powerful, and the US sort of regulated them a lot, with that to the outcome we now have. If we talk about the past, I researched the water mills, and even back then it was a lot of legal cases as well about who's going to get the power from the river, and then you couldn't build an arbitrarily high number of mills on the same river, and then there were fights about can you disperse the water here, who gets to build the canal, and whatever. There's definitely externalities happening, and a good legal framework, as they develop in Scotland at some time, can help with that, but you also have to be careful not to over-regulate it to not get the growth in the end.
One of the things that revolutionises the textile industry in the 18th century, even before the steam engine and the cotton mills, is the framework knitting machine, which was patented in the 1560s, and then becomes a really big thing in the fashion for stockings in the 17th and 18th century. For those of you who kind of like old pictures, everyone's always in a very good stocking. These things were, terribly desirable, huge market. Every Dutch town that had the knitting machine brought into it, kicked it out, regulated it away, and as a result, knitting boomed in England and did not boom in Holland. And in what we now call Holland, the textile industry never came back. So regulation is a double-sided coin. It enables us to we're giving ourselves the illusion that we can control the use of technology. But you've actually got to be very sensitive and very clever about this. And the question is centralised government the best thing or the best way to regulate things? I mean, if you look at the way that government is regulating markets now, it's going wide of the market. It's going too much, too little, to whatever it is. What we want is the Goldilocks, and that might not necessarily be the big state, but something else.
I think we've learned that there is this very fine line to walk, and that the over-regulation, and this is genuine, that there is this genuine concern that you simply stymie innovation, you stymie the adoption and use of technology, and that is, that has problematic outcomes for society. So the rush to regulate and legislate is a problem. So I don't think there's nothing you can look at and go, there's a great historical pattern here. Partially because the role of the state has fundamentally changed, and the scale and abilities to actually regulate outcomes has massively changed. But I think we've learned a lot of lessons, and I think we're now seeing this fine line walk between, we want to encourage the innovation and R&D. We are aware that there are severe externalities that come from this, but if we shut it down, what do we lose? And I think that's a really tricky. So I agree with Judy. I mean, the idea of sort of the nation state as the regulatory environment, or the sort of the transnational. Maybe we need to look at sort of different ways of thinking about regulation, where regulation is generated and how it's enforced.
I'm conscious of the terrible weather closing in, so
It's
one more question, Chris. Do you want to take this one?
Where's all the political opposition to this going to come from? So if we draw parallels with the past and think of the Luddites as an example, where you've got local people objecting, or your Dutch case to new technology, or the emergence of antitrust law, whereas the state is doing this. Where's the capacity now, if there is going to be some opposition to some of the excesses of AI? Where does it come from? If it's not from the state, the people, can we rise up and is that realistic? You know, so who's going to do it?
Go ahead and start a riot there.
Do you want to?
Can I just interject an example? Because you mentioned sort of, the creative arts. The arts and crafts movement is a response to industrialization because it's a moral and emotional response to machine-made things. And there were people in about 1860 who thought it was morally wrong to drink from a cup made on a machine. They really thought that something bad was going to happen to you. This is part. They have come from the machine breakers. They have come via lots of things. Now there are lots of really good positives about the arts and crafts movements. There's also, from an economic perspective, there's lots of bad ones. Like the idea that you can make money out of craft has bankrupted many a talented person. The idea that you should reject technology and just do everything by hand is an oversimplification of the thing. But what I'm trying to say is that very strong cultural and important cultural movements arise out of resistance, and I don't think it's clear at all where it's coming from, partially because we're really politically fragmented at the moment, but we should expect that there will be a cultural movement. So if we know that there is one, maybe we should start trying to think about what we'd like it to be, perhaps.
Yeah, well, it might come from the academics or whoever. Like people who lose their job because of AI will probably be not too happy about it. But as concerned as I am about where this all leads us in the end, I have to say I don't really think there is an alternative to us, that we can't really stop it, because we're also in an arms race with China at the moment, who are also developing their own AI models. So it's really tricky also in terms of regulation, what to regulate and how to deal with all this. And I think the only thing we can do is make sure that our governments follow a sensible approach in dealing with AI and regulating it.
Do you want a nice positive final note?
Where's the revolution come from? Right. So I think, so I like Judy's idea that there's kind of like this cultural sort of backlash, and actually there are preferences, we don't want this, we do want something else. I think where a lot of it will land is around data and around the sense of who actually owns, uses, monetizes the data of the individual. I think as that becomes more understood, as that becomes realized by more and more people what this is being used to enable, there will be questions, and there will be more fundamental questions that are asked. Do you want your biodata to be owned by Peter Thiel? Would be a question I would keep thinking about a lot. Go and ask yourself that. If you don't know who Peter Thiel is, go and look him up. He's a very interesting character. He's the owner of a company called Palantir that harvests huge amounts of data, just signed a deal with the NHS, major deals in the US. They want lots of data, and they want to use this to drive models that they say are going to have beneficial outcomes. Beneficial to whom? Is it to you? Where is your data gone in terms of driving these outcomes? I think those are questions that will become more and more fundamental, and as people grapple with them and think about them, they will push political challenges, they'll push cultural challenges, and there will be people who choose to make decisions that might be quite fundamentally different to the direction in which we're travelling at the moment.
Okay. I think we will have to call it there in the interest of time, unfortunately. The conversation will continue first near the bar and then at the bar when it opens. But I'm told it's not open quite yet. But at the risk of stealing your personal information, I promise this isn't that. This won't take any bioinformatic information, but there's a feedback form hidden behind this QR code if you'd like to scan it and fill it in. That would be greatly appreciated. If we can thank our speakers in the traditional way, I think it's been a really interesting evening, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. But please join me in thanking them. And I think.
Thank you.